First, we still seem to have world agriculture in disarray because of the gross inconsistencies between domestic support measures and trade policies where it concerns agriculture, as Joe clearly made very clear in his presentation. Vince also made very clear that food aid is in disarray in the sense of the way it's being delivered. U.S. food aid is too expensive for comfort, or it should be, and also too slow for comfort in the sense of getting timely to the people in need in order to save the lives that they're supposed to be saving. And then Valeria made very clear is that the controversy that emerges that from the adjustments, the domestic support measures that may come through the WTO arrangements, clearly have developing countries to stand a lot of gains, and the developed countries, the OECD countries, to lose out. So that's likely to be controversial, and one may ask the question, well, will we achieve anything at WTO on that front in December? So that's also some issues that I assume Kimberly and Simon will address in their discussion points, and then we give it back to you for your comments. Kimberly Ann, you have the floor.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks to Joe for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to IFPRI for these events. And I just want to make 3 quick points, sort of spinning off of the presentations and these very excellent set of papers that AEI is putting together on various Farm Bill issues. One is on the equity of the Farm Bill, second on the role of the WTO, and then a brief comment on ag policies beyond the Farm Bill that are important for global public goods and for developing countries. So just last week, I was at an event on talking about the generalized system of preferences trade preference program that's going to be expiring at the end of the year, and that Congress also needs to renew. And the first point I made was about the inequity, the general sort of the basic inequity and the structure of U.S. trade policy. And I think this applies very much to agriculture as well, based on the fact that U.S. tariffs are highest. And when I say inequity, it's both, it discriminates, U.S. trade policy discriminates against the poor in the United States as well as in the rest of the world, because the highest tariffs are on food, clothing, footwear. And within those categories, they tend to be higher on the lower cost items. And so there's a real need for reform with trade overall and with agriculture in particular. And you can look at some of the commodities. I think we were talking over lunch, tobacco, despite the fact that the U.S., the domestic production quotas were eliminated, there was no change in the quotas that restrict imports from the rest of the world. And the highest tariff, I think perhaps in the tariff code, it's 350% is on tobacco, which I know there are lots of problems with tobacco, but if we're going to have it as a legal product, why shouldn't we import it from Malawi instead of from Tennessee or Kentucky? So the highest tariffs are on some of the products that developing countries could otherwise export. Tobacco, peanuts is potentially one. Sugar is probably the biggest. And so there's a basic sort of equity both globally and then in terms of internally. One thing I would disagree with in one of the papers, I forget which one, was about that it's a problem that these tariffs and quotas raise prices on things like sugar. I think most of us would say it's probably not a problem to raise the price of sugar, but we could do it much more efficiently with an excise tax rather than a tariff on poor countries, and then use that to try and reduce demand, improve health, and so forth. There's also just this is sort of a transition then from the inequities to the role of the WTO, is the fact that most of the tariff rate quotas that the U.S. uses to restrict imports of sugar, I would also mention dairy-containing products, because the combination of those two things, sugar and dairy, prevents West Africa, which produces most of the cocoa in the world, from exporting chocolate to the United States. So creating jobs in processing and moving up the ladder, they can't do that because of these quotas. These quotas were mostly set, at least for sugar, were set back in the 1970s. So sub-Saharan Africa, based on the trade patterns at that time, sub-Saharan Africa has almost no quota access for sugar in the United States, none, I think, for chocolate. So reforming that set of systems to the degree that we have these quotas, at least we could look at updating them and making sure that the poorest countries have at least some chance of accessing the U.S. market. A couple of other things on the role of the WTO. One is the fact that even where reforms have occurred, in Europe, where the Common Agricultural Policy has moved from being very trade distorting to much less so, even though farmers still get very high payments, when they reformed their sugar program, they eliminated again the domestic quotas. They did nothing about the import quotas that also restrict access in Europe. Same thing in the United States. We got rid of domestic production quotas on tobacco and peanuts many years ago, but we still have that 350% tariff on tobacco, and we still have quotas on peanuts. So the WTO, I think countries have taken steps to reform, both the United States, Europe, elsewhere, to reform some of these domestic support policies. They have been unwilling to do anything about the tariffs and other trade restrictions outside of an international trade negotiation. So we need to find a way to try and get things going at the WTO again. We also need to make another try on agriculture at the WTO, because that seems to be politically sort of the hinge on which everything else turns. We haven't been able to get much of anything done at the WTO because the developing countries still want to see something happen on agriculture. Third point, which I'll just very quickly, because I'm running out of time, to plug my book on agriculture that came out earlier from CGD, is that there are a range of policies that affect global public goods in developing countries outside of the Farm Bill. And one that I've been working on and trying to continue some work on is the use of antibiotics, huge amounts of antibiotics that are used in livestock to prevent disease and to promote growth, not to treat disease. And that is having serious effects globally on the rise of these antibiotic-resistant superbugs. And then just the final thing, food aid reform. You know, it's one of the things, I think the frustration that all of us that are interested in seeing food aid reform, I found was just really summed up subtly but quite well in the paper by Chris and his colleagues, where they said, you know, quote, a growing body of research on food aid that is extraordinarily clear, and a couple of sentences later, that there's no debate remains among serious scholars who have studied this issue about the need for reform. And it is just about this iron triangle. I'm glad to hear Vince say that maybe the farm groups are starting to, you know, retreat a bit on food aid must be bought in the U.S. That I think if they would come out publicly and really fight for this, we might see some progress. But then we've got the maritime and some of the groups that are dependent on monetization that are also clinging to this clearly absurd system that we have for delivering food aid. And I applaud the authors of that paper, and Vince and Stephanie for their one on cargo preference as well, for bringing it out so clearly in these papers.